In the early 1980s, high up on the 4th floor of a tenement apartment somewhere located on the Lower East Side in New York, writer and co-editor of the Between C&D magazine Joel Rose received a letter containing a comic book submission from an anonymous source. Between C&D was an independent literary magazine formed in 1981 by Rose and his then wife Catherine Texier when Rose obtained his first book contract, the money of which allowed them to buy a dot matrix printer that they used as a printing press for both of their collections of stories, subsequently forming a fan base in the local area that would regularly send submissions to their apartment in the hopes of getting in the next issue. Rose would not use every submission he received, but would always reply to each one with a feedback note, opting never to send a copy and paste rejection slip. And it was with the submission from the anonymous source that he wrote, "Your drawing sucks, but your writing is really good," before returning to working on the magazine. 1 week later, Rose had once again been working in his apartment when he heard someone press the buzzer downstairs. Descending the stairs and opening the door, Rose came face to face with a lanky, long-haired stranger in chef whites who was high on heroin and who introduced himself as Anthony Bourdain, the author of the anonymous comic book submission. Rose invited Bourdain inside, and the two spoke for hours about the culinary world and Bourdain's interest in becoming a writer, subsequently forming a lifelong friendship. In the years that followed this encounter, the two kept in contact, with the topic of writing becoming a focal point in their discussions, and by the late 1990s, both men had released a few books to moderate applause. One day in the spring of 1999, among a series of emails going back and forth between the two men, Rose received an email from Bourdain, who had recently made a trip to Tokyo, a trip he had been asked to take by the owners of the Leao restaurant he worked in at the time, with the purpose of teaching the chefs at the Tokyo branch to make the food look and taste like it does in New York. During his stay, Bourdain fulfilled his obligations, and in his spare time wandered the streets aimlessly, dipping into various soba shops and scanning the local markets in wonderment, subsequently documenting his experiences in the email to Rose. Rose, amazed by Bourdain's writing, printed the email and showed it to his new wife, Karen Rinaldi, a book publisher, who was so impressed she got in contact with Bourdain's agent, Kimberly Witherspoon, a close friend of hers, and offered Bourdain a contract to write a book. The timing was convenient, as Bourdain's now infamous article, "Don't Eat Before Reading This," had recently been published by The New Yorker, and so when Bourdain returned from Tokyo, he had an offer he couldn't refuse from Rinaldi, alongside some publicity with his New Yorker feature. What transpired from this offer was Kitchen Confidential, published on the 22nd of May 2000. Kitchen Confidential is essentially an extension of Don't Eat Before Reading This, in that it tells of the gritty insider secrets of the restaurant business. Yet it is also a memoir, as Bourdain tells the story of his development as a chef up until the present day. And the book changed Bourdain's life overnight, as he went from an unknown chef at Leao to a best-selling author appearing on David Letterman and Oprah in his early 40s, a time of life where the excitement is supposedly supposed to die down. And so, after a few months of flogging Kitchen Confidential on the media circuit, Bourdain, who still had his day job at this point, had returned home with ideas of a second book that he pitched to his publisher. He would travel around to far-flung areas of the world, eating the exotic local cuisines, all with the sole intention of searching for the perfect meal, and surprisingly for Bourdain, the idea was greenlighted. A few days later, two show producers, Lydia Tenalia and Christopher Collins, walked into Leao and asked Bourdain for the rights to make a show out of Kitchen Confidential. The rights had already been bought by someone else, Bourdain explained. However, they were free to follow him with cameras whilst he was travelling for his second book if they were interested. The two agreed and said they would pitch the idea to the Food Network. Following the agreement, the two called Bourdain back a day or two later to let him know they had secured a meeting, which was a success as the Food Network agreed to take on the project. Thus, Bourdain left his home in New York to eat around the world with a crew behind him during the rest of the year 2000 and the greater part of 2001, culminating in his follow-up book, A Cook's Tour, in search of the perfect meal, published on November 5th, 2002, alongside a TV show of the same name that aired its first episode on January 8th of the same year. Bourdain's beginnings as a TV personality all started with the events detailed in this book. The bulk of A Cook's Tour is made up of 15 chapters, each detailing the events that had transpired in various countries including Portugal, France, Vietnam, Spain, Russia, Morocco, Japan, Cambodia, England, Mexico, America, and Scotland. Bourdain had entered these countries with the same philosophy on food he had expressed in Kitchen Confidential. The philosophy of being open to experience, rejecting familiar chain restaurants that were all too familiar in the Western world, and instead opting for the local cuisine, risking the possibility of the bad meal in exchange for the life-changing one. We thus see Bourdain stay true to his words throughout the book as he samples the local cuisine in every country, yet he also tells of the wider adventures he had whilst visiting these areas, with the food only appearing to be a tool for finding an understanding in these foreign cultures where language could not. In Portugal, he watched the traumatizing spectacle of the slaughtering of a pig that had been fattened for 6 months specifically for him in the chapter Where Food Comes From, and saw how Jose, Bourdain's Portuguese boss, and his family make use of every part of the pig. The bladder was used as a football for the kids to play with. In France, Bourdain tried to imitate the revelatory experience he had had as a child when he ate an oyster, an experience that preceded the years of working in the restaurant business, in the chapter Back to the Beach. And in Japan, Bourdain returned to Tokyo in the chapter Tokyo Redux, adamant to make better use of his time than he did on his first visit in 1999. I missed a lot the last time I was in Japan. I wasted a lot of time working and wandering blindly about. Early on, I'd been intimidated by the strangeness, the crowds, the different languages. I'd been reluctant at first to throw myself into it, to plunge right into packed noodle joints and businessmen's bars. This time I was determined, at the very least, to miss less. Tokyo was the first place Bourdain and the crew filmed in, yet it was made to be the 9th chapter of the book, and is essentially a sequel to the chapter in Kitchen Confidential titled Mission to Tokyo. Courtesy of the Food Network, Bourdain was supplied with a guide who took him to the Tsukiji fish market where they bought ingredients for edamame sushi, which his guide later prepared for Bourdain in quick succession, before the two shared multiple glasses of sake together. Following this, Bourdain travelled to the seaside town Atami to spend the night at a ryokan, a country inn, where he experienced a tea ceremony known as kaiseki, a ceremony that includes many subtle formalities that were a cause of anxiety for Bourdain prior to arriving. He details his nervous arrival at the inn and his changing into ill-fitting clothes before sitting down cross-legged to eat on his own, besides the 2 geishas and manager of the inn who serve and help him. Food and sake are given to Bourdain in succession, and he begins to slowly ease his tensions, allowing him to better appreciate the experience, which climaxes with a musical performance from the 2 geishas. Bourdain also aligned his time of arrival in Japan to correspond with the fugu season, fugu being the deadly pufferfish of legend, whose liver, if cooked incorrectly, can be deadly, and Bourdain had hopes of trying it himself. However, upon hiring a professional chef to make the dish for him, Bourdain's excitement of what was thought to be a near-death experience dwindled as he watched the rigorous safety precautions involved in the making of the food, of which, due to his expectations of danger, tasted no more exciting than any other fish. Lastly, Bourdain visits a dojo and eats chankanabe with sumo wrestlers at a local restaurant. The chapter ends as Bourdain struggles to stand up due to how much he ate, and as he stumbles out of the restaurant, he bumps into some drunken businessmen he had made friends with on his first night in Tokyo, who greet him excitedly as the crazy man chef, before asking him what he plans on eating next. As well as romantically detailing the adventures of his travels, Bourdain also notes the two irritating camera operators following his every move, trying desperately to get him to cooperate with the basic necessities of making a travel show and being a good presenter. Bourdain organises these segments into a 5-part series called Reasons Why You Don't Want to Be on Television, the 5 of which appear sporadically throughout the book. Bourdain had wrongly assumed that Tenalia and Collins would simply film over his shoulder during his travels, yet he soon came to realise he would have to look at the camera and inform the audience, not just be filmed, leading to Bourdain and the two butting heads over differences in what they wanted the show to be, the most of which Bourdain used as a comic relief in contrast to the more bleak aspects of the book. In part 1, which appears in the chapter Back to the Beach, and part 4 in the chapter set in Mexico called Where Cooks Come From, Bourdain is forced to feign interest in meals he had no intention of eating for the good of the show. The former shows Bourdain watching the preparations of making foie gras, which when eaten, causes him and some crew members to be sick. The chapter ends with Bourdain delirious, dry heaving and shivering in his room. In the latter, Bourdain is made to eat iguana. "I never wanted to eat iguana." "Yes you do," insisted the TV masterminds. "I had no particular curiosity about iguana. I knew from talking to cooks that people eat iguana when they can afford nothing else. It's cheap and plentiful." Despite iguana supposedly being cheap and plentiful, Bourdain and crew searched endlessly and found nowhere where they could get any, concluding on the manager of the hotel they were staying in at the time, to Bourdain's dismay, killing the hotel mascot and serving him up as a last resort. As Bourdain predicted, the iguana tasted horrible, and the only shot of him eating it in the show displayed a man who looks as if he were being held at gunpoint. Part 5 of the series in the chapter set in the US titled West Coast is similar to the previous 2, yet instead Bourdain is made to spend the evening eating vegan food with local vegans who wanted to cook for him. For anyone that knows Bourdain, they would understand that this was probably the worst thing he ate during his travels. Other parts in the series, such as part 2 in the chapter How to Drink Vodka, set in, unsurprisingly, Russia, and part 3 in the chapter set in Morocco titled Something Very Special, show examples of Bourdain having to compromise with TV show producers for the betterment of the viewing experience. In part 2, Bourdain and Russian friend Zamir are made to film an establishing shot of them entering a restaurant and explaining to the audience where they were, why they were there, and what they were expecting to find. However, due to Bourdain and crew forgetting to do it prior to actually entering the restaurant, Bourdain and Zamir had to complete this shot drunk off vodka and full to the stomach, which made for multiple retakes, resulting in one satisfactory shot that Bourdain said could be fixed in the edit. Lastly, in part 3, Bourdain is to interview a couple who has housed him during his stay in Morocco, with the typical Q&A questions you will find in a traditional travel show, which, as you could expect, Bourdain was not willing to put the nice couple through. Consequently, a producer has to fly out to talk to him. An executive producer was flown out from New York to soothe my troubled conscience, to help me feel better about the enterprise. She showed me some rough cuts of earlier shows, pointed out that I wasn't doing that badly. If I remembered to look at the camera, if only I'd stopped cursing and smoking and slagging other Food Network chefs all the time, maybe look at a map before visiting a country. Looking back in hindsight, Bourdain did not take this advice on board. During his travels, Bourdain would also visit what would become his favourite country, Vietnam. In the book, Vietnam features most of all, appearing in 4 of the 16 chapters, and in each one, the overhanging theme of America's influence seems to dominate Bourdain's perspective as he slowly comes to love the country. In the chapter The Burn, set in the city of Ho Chi Minh, also known as Saigon, this theme presents itself at the tail end, as the bulk of the chapter recounts Bourdain as he wanders through a hail of scooters and bikes, finding his way through the streets and down the alleyways, picking up souvenirs like dead soldiers' Zippo lighters, before stopping at a market where he bounced from stall to stall, trying varying styles of Vietnamese cuisine, with the only constant being the hospitality with which he was greeted, and bowls of pho. Yet the ever-increasing fun of Bourdain is brought down to reality when, as he leaves a market early in the morning and strolls into the streets fully taken in by the Vietnam experience, he is approached by a begging man with a pudding bowl haircut atop an entirely burnt face, a victim of a napalm bombing. Bourdain, disgusted at the triviality with which his quest for the perfect meal had seemed at seeing the man, can only stare as the word napalm hangs over his head, and subsequently walks away feeling guilty and conscious of the casual observer's association with his nationality and the burns of the victim. I spy a few other West End tourists across the street in Banana Republic shorts and Land's End polo shirts, comfortably shod in Weejuns and Birkenstocks, and I want suddenly and irrationally to kill them. They look evil, like carrion eaters. The inscribed Zippo in my pocket burns. No longer amusing, suddenly about as funny as the shrunken head of a close friend. Everything I eat will taste like ashes now. Fuck writing books. Fuck making television. This theme continues to permeate throughout all the chapters in Vietnam, yet Bourdain's appreciation for the country still outshines the unshakable acknowledgement. In the second to last chapter of the book, titled Very, Very Strong, Bourdain admits he has fallen in love with Vietnam and its unyielding pride. Back in Ho Chi Minh, Bourdain makes mention of the US's influence on the country as he notes the paintings on the walls of the hotel he was staying in at the time. He then visits Madame Nhop's restaurant and eats what he claims was the best food he had eaten since arriving in Vietnam, before heading to an underwhelming bar called Apocalypse Now, where he and the crew intended to celebrate the new year. Lastly, Bourdain eats the still beating heart of a cobra solely for the TV show and drinks down rice wine mixed with cobra's blood. After a few long days of exploration, a jubilant Bourdain, now back in the hotel and knowing he will soon be leaving, champions the country of Vietnam, ending the chapter with a few lines. I'm leaving Vietnam soon, and yet I'm yearning for it already. I grab a stack of damp dong off my nightstand, get dressed and head for the market. There's a lot I haven't tried. I'm still here, I tell myself. I'm still here. The book ends with a small conclusive chapter titled Perfect, in which Bourdain answers the question of what the perfect meal is, and states he has learned something since being on the road. That thing being, it doesn't do to waste. The whole concept of the perfect meal is ludicrous. Perfect, like happy, tends to sneak up on you. Once you find it, like Thomas Keller says, it's gone. It's a fleeting thing, perfect. And if you're anything like me, it's often better in retrospect. After over a year's worth of travelling the globe, sampling the local cuisine, and filming for the Food Network, Bourdain settled down somewhere in the French West Indies and wrote a cook's tour in search of the perfect meal, which, like Kitchen Confidential before it, became a New York Times bestseller. The perfect meal was never something to be found, as was obvious from the start, yet what Bourdain had unexpectedly found and developed during his travels was his skills in front of the camera. Once the crew had reached Vietnam, Bourdain's initial reluctance to be filmed had suddenly completely changed, and coupled with his already established ability to write being implemented into the voiceovers, A Cook's Tour became one of the more watchable shows on the Food Network. The show would thus perform well, yet tensions between Bourdain and the Food Network eventually led to the show's demise, as Bourdain, whilst filming an episode in Spain after being invited to film the creative processes of El Bulli chef Ferran Adria, was told by the Food Network to cut the Adria stuff and instead focus on more domestic topics. Bourdain and crew ignored these requests and filmed the episode anyway, eventually selling the episode to the Travel Channel under the new name No Reservations. The episode aired on July 25, 2005. No Reservations would thus continue Bourdain's career as a TV personality, lasting into its final episode on November 5, 2012, where CNN would fund his third and final show, often known to be his best, Parts Unknown. Parts Unknown would become Bourdain's most celebrated work, winning countless awards with Bourdain and crew maintaining full creative control throughout the series, and would appear as a stark contrast to the decent but not amazing A Cook's Tour, where Bourdain was finding his feet as a travel show host. All the while, Bourdain would continue writing and releasing books, and would also collaborate with Joel Rose, with whom he released 3 comic books. In hindsight, when we imagine Bourdain sitting hunched over a computer in some cramped residential hotel in Tokyo, typing out that email to Rose in which he details his adventures of darting down alleyways, finding the most uninviting soba shops, fearlessly entering, sitting down next to some random man and pointing in his direction to the man behind the bar before saying, "I'll have what he's having." We can't help notice how his email echoed the basic sentiment of what Bourdain would soon turn into the ambassador of. Bourdain's way of travel always championed trailing off the beaten path, becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable, and always being open to a new experience, a sentiment first discovered in Tokyo but fully formed during his travels for a cook's tour, and one he continued to follow up until his untimely death on June 8, 2018, when Anthony Bourdain was found dead in his hotel in France whilst filming for Parts Unknown, the victim of a suicide. He was 61 years old. I only became a fan of Bourdain sometime earlier this year, and so I cannot personally speak for the public's reaction when news of his death broke out. If you're looking for a good video that can, I recommend this one. However, I can understand the influence he had. As Bourdain wrote in Mission to Tokyo, he should have been a dead man at least 2 times over, and by his early 40s, he had resigned himself to a life of dunking fries at Leal, the eye-opening, revelatory experiences having been lived out already, or missed entirely. Yet, with perseverance and a little bit of luck, Bourdain got a second chance for new experiences, and he made the absolute most of it. During his second go at life, as well as the many countries he visited, he also formed new friendships with fellow chefs like Eric Ripert and Jose Andres, among more, who, after his untimely death, encouraged those who are fans of Bourdain to celebrate June 25th, Bourdain's birthday, as Bourdain Day, instead of focusing on the date of his death. This year would mark the 5th Bourdain Day since his death, the first of which I will personally be conscious of, and not knowing in what way to acknowledge that day, I, and I hope you, will look to Andreas for some advice on how to celebrate. I hope that this is a place that many people will go, will enjoy life, will have a drink, they will cook, they will go to a food truck, they will go to a picnic, they will go to a street vendor, a hot dog, a fancy restaurant, whatever, and they will toast Tony and wish Happy Bourdain Day.